Time froze as Julian stepped inside by accident. Their eyes locked, hers wide with shock, his frozen with horror. She covered herself, stammering apologies she didn't owe anyone. And he stumbled back, apologizing in a panic before slamming the door. Julian Hartwell stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, watching the city glow and pulse 40 stories below. And even though he was only 38 and already one of the youngest billionaires in America thanks to his company, Hartwell Digital Solutions, which practically reinvented cloud technology, all he felt in that moment was a deep emptiness sitting quietly inside him. His penthouse was 5,000 square feet of expensive marble, curated art, custom furniture, everything arranged perfectly by award-winning designers, but the silence and the temperature-controlled perfection made the place feel more like a museum than a home. He loosened his tie and checked his watch. It was past 11 at night, but he still couldn't sleep because his mind kept racing with mergers, quarterly projections, and all the noise that came with being a man who controlled too much. As he walked through the spotless living room, his footsteps echoing on the polished floors, he noticed the light still on near the staff hallway, a part of the penthouse he almost pretended didn't exist. That was where Leila Carter slept, the girl who lived quietly in the shadows, the girl who came to New York 6 months earlier with a single old suitcase, leaving behind rural Georgia, her sick grandmother, and a nursing program she could no longer afford because medical bills had eaten everything she had. The placement agency had told her Julian was professional, always busy, barely at home, and didn't like unnecessary interaction with staff, and the pay was good enough for her to send money home and dream of returning to school one day. Her tiny room behind the kitchen was small but clean, and every morning she woke before sunrise to clean rooms Julian rarely entered, arrange flowers he never noticed, and prepare food he barely touched. She worked like a ghost in her own home, careful, invisible, moving without noise, keeping her head down because life had taught her that girls without money survived better when they stayed unnoticed. She wrote letters to her grandmother at night from her tiny window, describing the city lights that felt like stars she could almost touch, until the night everything changed. After cleaning up from Julian's dinner meeting, she dragged herself to her room, peeled off her damp uniform, and reached for a nightshirt when the doorknob suddenly turned. Time froze as Julian stepped inside by accident. Their eyes locked, hers wide with shock, his frozen with horror. She covered herself, stammering apologies she didn't owe anyone, and he stumbled back, apologizing in a panic before slamming the door. She sank on her bed, shaking, terrified she would be fired and lose everything her grandmother depended on. Julian stood outside, heart pounding, realizing he had terrified the one person in his apartment who deserved peace. That night neither of them slept. She replayed the humiliation in her mind while he sat in bed overwhelmed with guilt and memories of his childhood, the divorce, the coldness, the vow to never be vulnerable again. Morning came heavy. When he found her preparing coffee, she tried to stay professional, but he insisted on apologizing sincerely, telling her it was his fault, not hers, and for the first time since she arrived, she saw him as more than the cold billionaire. Over the next weeks, tiny cracks formed in the walls around Julian's life. He noticed her long hours, her worn shoes, the quiet exhaustion in her shoulders. He found her writing letters about hope and home, and learned she once studied nursing but had to give it up. He saw her dreams, small but sincere, and something in him softened. He started coming home earlier, sitting with her in the kitchen, asking about her grandmother, her childhood, her poetry. She learned about his mother, his lonely childhood, the empire he built to protect himself from weakness. Slowly they began to see each other. One night he secretly paid her grandmother's medical bills through a hospital program. She cried when she heard the news, but he said nothing. Soon he bought her books and she left him notes with thoughtful quotes. Their quiet friendship grew until the night he invited her to a Philharmonic concert. He provided a dress, waited respectfully outside her room, and when she emerged he saw a softness, a beauty untouched by the world he lived in. At the concert she glowed, swaying gently to the music, and he found himself watching her more than the orchestra. On the ride home their hands brushed, and neither pulled away. The next morning he confessed his feelings, nervous in a way billionaires rarely felt, admitting she had changed him and made him see life again. She tried to deny it, terrified of the consequences, but finally admitted she felt the same, though she feared the world would judge her harshly. Julian promised they would face everything together. The next day he fired her, not from cruelty, but to remove the power imbalance between them, and hired her instead as a consultant for a new corporate responsibility program, a role paying her enough to build a real life. She panicked at first, not understanding, until he explained that he couldn't pursue a relationship while she worked under him, and he wanted her to stand beside him, not beneath him. He told her the job would be hers even if she didn't want a relationship, and he revealed that her grandmother's medical bills were secured for 5 years, no strings attached. Overwhelmed by his sincerity, Leila accepted the position. Weeks passed, and she began sitting in executive meetings, observing how workers were talked about like numbers, not humans. She took notes constantly, listening more than she spoke, and one afternoon she presented her first proposal. A complete overhaul of the lowest-paid worker system, suggesting fair wages, proper health care, childcare support, and mental health resources for struggling families. Julian listened with pride. Her ideas were fresh, grounded in real experience, everything his corporation had been ignoring for years. Together they built an entire corporate reform program. Scholarships for low-income students, medical funds for families in crisis, community tech centers in underserved neighborhoods. The media noticed, then the board, then the entire industry. And through the chaos, their relationship grew quietly but steadily, built not on power or desperation, but on respect and shared purpose. Julian softened, laughed more, came home earlier, and sometimes sat with Leila on the floor eating simple meals she cooked because she said billionaires needed real food too. She grew confident, stronger, braver in rooms full of executives who once would have dismissed her. Months later, he introduced her publicly, not as his employee, but as the visionary behind the company's reforms. People talked, of course, but their work spoke louder than gossip. And on a calm spring evening, standing with her by the penthouse window where everything began, Julian finally admitted that loving her had saved him from a life of shiny emptiness. And Leila realized she had built more than a job or a career. She had built a future where she was seen, valued, and loved. The girl who came to New York as a shadow had become the woman who changed a billionaire, a corporation, and eventually thousands of lives. All because one accidental moment forced two lonely hearts to finally see each other. But life didn't stay peaceful for long, because the moment Julian introduced Leila publicly as the mind behind his company's reforms, the world reacted with the kind of noise neither of them had ever prepared for. Within 24 hours, social media exploded with pictures of them standing together at the corporate press event, and comments flooded in. Some praising her brilliance and humility, others tearing her apart with accusations that she was only a maid who got lucky by sleeping with a billionaire. And while Julian ignored the noise easily, Leila felt every word like a needle in her chest, remembering all the times she fought to survive quietly, invisible, and now suddenly she was visible in the loudest, harshest way possible. The executives who had smiled politely in meetings began whispering behind her back, calling her an amateur, a charity case, a distraction, and one of them, Martin Graves, a senior VP who had been eyeing Julian's position for years, made it his personal mission to make her fail. He started sabotaging her proposals, altering documents before meetings, feeding the media stories that painted her as Julian's puppet, and soon rumors spread that she only got her job because he was emotionally compromised. At the same time, Leila's grandmother fell seriously ill again, and the small hospital back in Georgia called to say she needed a risky heart procedure that required constant observation. Guilt washed over Leila, pulling her back toward the life she had left, making her feel torn between the grandmother who raised her and the new world she was barely learning to belong in. One evening she returned to the penthouse with swollen eyes after crying in the elevator, unable to hide it, and Julian immediately pulled her close, his chest tightening as he listened to her whisper that everything felt too heavy. Her grandmother's failing health, the online harassment, the executives turning cold, the feeling that she didn't belong in his world no matter how hard she tried. Just when Julian promised they would travel to Georgia together that weekend to see her grandmother, another storm hit. His estranged father, Henry Hartwell, a ruthless businessman who once controlled half of Wall Street's private funds, returned to New York after years of silence, furious that Julian was destroying the Hartwell legacy by wasting money on reforms and surrounding himself with people beneath the family name. And he made his entrance by barging into Julian's office unannounced, slamming papers on the table, saying the board was reconsidering Julian's position as CEO. Henry threatened to use his remaining connections to call for a vote to remove Julian from leadership, and when he found out about Leila's past as a housekeeper, he didn't hesitate to weaponize it, telling Julian that men like us don't risk empires for girls who wash dishes. The words sliced through Julian like a blade, not because he believed them, but because he remembered being 12 years old, watching his father crush his mother's spirit with the same cold cruelty, and he swore he would never allow anyone to speak to Leila that way. But the damage was growing. Media outlets began digging into her past, interviewing neighbors from her childhood town, twisting her story into something shameful, and Martin Graves leaked confidential information to the press, framing her reforms as financially irresponsible. One night Leila found her face on a tabloid cover outside a convenience store with the headline, "The Billionaire and His Maid. Power play or love story?" And something inside her broke in a quiet, painful way. She returned to the penthouse and told Julian she couldn't do this, that she felt like she was ruining his company, dragging his reputation through the dirt, and tearing his world apart. Julian grabbed her hands tightly, insisting she wasn't going anywhere, that she was the only part of his world that ever felt real. But Leila pulled away gently, tears streaking her cheeks, saying she needed to clear her head and go to Georgia to see her grandmother alone, because staying in the penthouse suddenly felt like drowning in a life too big for her. She packed a small suitcase, the same one she brought from Georgia months earlier, and left quietly in the morning before Julian woke, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that simply said, "I love you but I need to breathe." When Julian found the note, something inside him cracked open, not with anger but with fear, the same fear he swore he would never feel again, and he realized that losing Leila would destroy him far more than losing any company or title ever could. Meanwhile, Leila sat on a quiet bus headed back to Georgia, staring out the window as the city disappeared behind her, wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life, unaware that forces in both their worlds were moving in ways that would soon push them into a storm far bigger than gossip, the soft orange corporate politics, the familiar family expectations, and old wooden fences because what awaited them next would test their love, and even though her heart felt heavy, and everything they thought they had rebuilt together when she walked through the hospital door made everything pause for a moment. But the peace didn't last because her grandmother's condition was worse than the doctors first said. And Leila found herself sitting by her bedside every night, torn between the life she had run back to and the life she had left behind. She tried to silence the ache inside her by focusing on the familiar smells of home. The pine trees, the old church bell, the sound of cicadas. But at night she lay awake replaying Julian's face in her mind, the way he held her hands, the way he said she wasn't alone, and the guilt hit her harder than any headline ever could. Meanwhile in New York, Julian's world spiraled faster than he could catch it. Martin Graves succeeded in calling an emergency board meeting. The executives split into camps, the media frenzy grew louder, and his father kept fanning the flames with backdoor threats, claiming Julian had lost control and was letting a girl with no pedigree ruin the company's image. For the first time in years, Julian felt fear, not the cold fear of losing power, but the warm, aching fear of losing the one person who made him feel alive. And when he tried calling Leila, she didn't answer, afraid that hearing his voice would make her run back before she had time to think. On the third night without sleep, Julian made a decision that shocked everyone. He walked into the boardroom full of executives who expected him to beg for his position. And instead he calmly placed his resignation letter on the table, telling them that if the price of humanity was losing his title, then the company could keep it. The room erupted in chaos, but Julian didn't look back. He left the building with a strange sense of peace, finally choosing love and purpose over power and legacy. Without telling anyone, not even his father, he booked a flight to Georgia, rented a small car, and drove straight to the hospital where Leila was caring for her grandmother. When she walked out into the hallway and saw him standing there in jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt, not the billionaire CEO but just a man in love, her breath caught painfully in her throat. She whispered, "Why are you here?" And he answered simply, "Because every part of my life that doesn't include you feels empty." The tears she'd been holding back for days finally fell, and before she could speak, he gently cupped her face and told her he stepped down as CEO. Leila froze, stunned, whispering, "You gave up everything." And he shook his head, saying, "I didn't give up anything. I just stopped holding on to what was killing me." For the first time, she smiled through her tears, understanding the depth of what he'd done. They spent the next days together in Georgia, caring for her grandmother, walking the quiet roads, watching the sky turn pink at dusk, and slowly, pieces of themselves they didn't know were broken began to heal. Her grandmother held Julian's hand during one visit and told him softly, "Love isn't about the life you build, it's about who you build it with." And those words settled into both of their hearts like a prayer. When her grandmother came out of surgery stronger than expected, Leila finally allowed herself to breathe, to hope. And on a warm Sunday afternoon, as the three of them sat on the small porch of the old wooden house, Julian got down on one knee, not with extravagance or diamonds but with sincerity that shook her soul, telling her that he didn't want a life of penthouses and silence anymore. He wanted a life where she was beside him, building something real. Leila cried and laughed at the same time, whispering yes as he slid a simple silver ring onto her finger. They didn't move back to New York. Instead, they chose something different, something quieter, opening a community tech and nursing center in Georgia, using the consulting payout Julian negotiated before resigning. A center that offered scholarships, medical support, and opportunities for families who struggled just like Leila once did. Their names began to spread again, but this time with honor, not gossip. The billionaire and the girl who changed him. And on one beautiful summer evening, as Leila stood beside Julian watching children run around the new center and her grandmother smiled from her rocking chair, she realized that her entire life had led her to this moment. And Julian realized that the emptiness he once felt had been replaced with something vibrant, warm, and whole. The girl who once arrived in New York as a shadow had become the woman who built a future filled with purpose and love. And the man who once lived in cold marble rooms now woke up every day grateful that a single accidental moment opened a door neither of them ever expected to walk through. Their story didn't end with wealth or power. It ended with two hearts choosing each other, choosing healing, choosing a life they built hand in hand, far away from the noise of the world, in a place where love finally made sense.